The man known to history as King Stephen of England was born at some time in the mid-1090s. Some historians, who are acknowledged authorities on his life and reign, argue for a year of birth as early as 1092. Others suggest he could have been born as late as 1096. It is important to bear this in mind, especially when considering the events of the 1100s and 1110s, as the gap of 4 years make a considerable difference in evaluating whether Stephen's actions at these times were those of a child, a teenager, or a young man. There is more consensus concerning his place of birth, and it is generally accepted that he was born in the town of Blois, in the Loire Valley between Orléans and Tours. Stephen's father was Stephen Henry, Count of Blois, a major French feudal lord of the late 11th century. He was already a man of about 50 years at the time of Stephen's birth. If Stephen was born in 1096, then he would have arrived after his father had left for the Holy Land to take part in the First Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christian cause. Stephen's mother was Adela of Normandy. She was born in the second half of the 1060s and was a daughter of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who, in 1066, led a Norman army across the English Channel and began the conquest of England right around the time Adela was born. Her marriage to Stephen Henry in the early 1080s was a political union designed to forge an alliance between her father, by then King William I of England, and the Count of Blois. Her father died in 1087 and was succeeded by his son, Adela's brother, King William II, better known as William Rufus, most likely in reference to his red hair or beard. Hence, when Stephen was born in the mid-1090s, his uncle was the King of England. Stephen's wider family exerted influence beyond England itself. When William the Conqueror conquered England, he was already Duke of Normandy and had extended his rule over some other adjoining territories in northern France as well, such that the family controlled lands on both sides of the English Channel. Indeed, the Conqueror considered his primary role to be that of Duke of Normandy, even after conquering England, and he spent much of the 1070s and 1080s in France, even after becoming ruler of England. After his death, his territories did not pass undivided to William Rufus. Instead, the Conqueror's other sons, Robert and Henry, played the greater role in Normandy and the other French territories, while William Rufus ruled England. This arrangement was scuppered in August 1100, when the king was killed during a suspicious hunting accident in the New Forest in Hampshire in England. When this occurred, his brother Henry quickly moved to seize power and became the new monarch as King Henry I of England. With this, Stephen, who was still a child, aged between 4 and 8, depending on his year of birth, swapped having one uncle as King of England for another, while his third uncle, Robert, would exercise control over Normandy for some years to come. Although in 1106 he was defeated militarily by Henry at the Battle of Tinchebray and imprisoned for the rest of his life. Consequently, much of Stephen's life would be lived in the shadow of his powerful uncle, who, from 1106 onwards, controlled England and the family's territories in Normandy and elsewhere in northern France. As with any monarch of the High Middle Ages, there are only a small number of administrative records or examples of correspondence that has survived for the near millennium since Stephen's time, with which to shed light on his life. As a result, we are largely reliant on the histories and chronicles of the era in order to reconstruct the events which involved Stephen and the role he played in them. These were mostly written by ecclesiastical figures, monks or abbots and bishops, who were close to those in power. One was the Historia Novella, or New History of William of Malmesbury, a highly learned monk who was born in the mid-1090s too, and was an exact contemporary of Stephen's. The Benedictine monk Orderic Vitalis wrote an ecclesiastical history which covers the period up to 1141 and sheds extensive light on Stephen's life prior to becoming King of England and the first years of his reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a long account of the history of medieval England, provides an illuminating narrative of how damaged the social and economic fabric of England was by the civil wars of the 1140s, to which, as we will see, Stephen was so central. Finally, the Gesta Stephani, or Acts of Stephen, is perhaps the greatest source of all for Stephen's time as King of England. The text was anonymous, though some historians of 12th century England contend that it was composed by Robert of Bath, the Bishop of Bath between 1136 and 1166, and an eyewitness to many of the events described in the Gesta. Unfortunately, because it could not have been predicted that Stephen would one day become King of England, these chroniclers were not paying attention to the obscure younger son of the Count of Blois in his earliest years, and we know very little about Stephen's early life. He was evidently raised at home in Blois. He had numerous siblings, including an older brother by the name of William. Under normal circumstances, in a society where primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son would succeed to a noble title, was emerging in its full form, it might have been expected that Stephen would have lived his life in the shadow of his older brother. However, William is believed to have been intellectually challenged in some way. There is no clear description of this, but he acquired the rather crude sobriquet William the Simple, which probably indicates some psychological or mental issue, one which largely precluded him from playing an active role in political and military affairs. In his stead, Stephen and his other older brother Theobald emerged early on as the most capable of Stephen Henry and Adela's sons. Another brother of theirs, Odo, died at a young age. Stephen received a decent enough education during these years by the standards of the time. Where his grandfather, William the Conqueror, was illiterate, Stephen was taught to read and write and was able to understand Latin, a sign of the Renaissance in learning which was occurring across Europe during this period as the continent's first universities were set up and began to produce new generations of scholars and teachers. Stephen's father was absent during his earliest years. He took part in the First Crusade to the Holy Land, which succeeded in setting up a number of Christian states there in 1098 and 1099. The Count of Blois's contribution to the effort was dubious, though. He was present at the siege of the city of Antioch in 1098, but he abandoned the crusade to head home at a critical juncture in the assault on the city. To compound matters, he was believed to have met with the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos on his way back through Anatolia and convinced the emperor that the crusade was a lost cause and that he should not march onwards to aid the Christian armies. In the event, he proved to be completely wrong in his analysis, and after the successful capture of Antioch, the Crusaders went on to conquer nearly all of the region, approximating with modern-day Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, as well as parts of Syria and Jordan. During his absence in the east, Stephen's mother, Adela, headed up a regency government in Blois. She evidently liked the power it conveyed on her, and as soon as her husband arrived back to France, she began trying to convince him to head back east on crusade as quickly as possible. He eventually agreed to do so, and in 1101 left again for the Levant. He made it to Jerusalem on this occasion, where a Crusader kingdom had been established after his premature flight home in 1098. The following year, before he could return to France, having completed his vow to visit the Holy City, he was captured by an Islamic army and executed shortly afterwards. Hence, other than a fleeting period in 1099 and 1100, when he was back in France, Stephen's memory of his father would have been almost non-existent. He grew up much closer to his mother Adela and, unusually for a noble child at the time, was raised in her household. When news of their father's death arrived to France, Stephen's older brother Theobald was made Count of Blois, though he was only 11 or 12 years old at the time, and Adela would continue to act as regent for several years to come. While Theobald had succeeded as Count of Blois on their father's death, this certainly did not preclude Stephen from aspiring to a position of authority in France or the wider world of Western Europe. This was especially the case in light of the difficult circumstances prevailing in England and Normandy. Henry I had over 20 children, but most of them were born as a result of relationships outside of marriage, and so, by the standards of medieval Europe, could not be considered as legitimate successors to his dominions. Conversely, he had left it very late to marry, not finally wedding his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, until 1100, when Henry was already into his 30s, an old age to marry by the standards of the High Middle Ages. Having married, the union did result in 2 children in quick succession, a daughter named Matilda after her mother in the spring of 1102, and a son named William Adelin in August 1103. Thereafter the marriage produced no further children, and so the succession to Henry rested principally on just one legitimate male heir, William Adelin. Given the tenuous nature of the succession and the lack of a spare male heir, Henry began taking an interest in his nephew in the 1100s. It was an indication of Stephen's promise as he grew up that his uncle increasingly viewed him as someone who might play a major role in the governance of the French part of his dominions in Normandy and adjoining territories. This promotion of young Stephen took place in the years after 1106, following Henry's defeat of his brother Robert and seizure of the Duchy of Normandy. In response to the imprisonment of Robert by Henry, King Louis VI of France began promoting the claim of William Clito, Robert's son and heir, to succeed as Duke of Normandy. This placed Henry in a difficult position, as it was not easy to govern his new French territories from England. Therefore, he began constructing an alliance of friendly French nobles that would serve to protect Normandy from attacks by Louis and the other supporters of William Clito. Part of this involved courting his sister and the lords of the county of Blois, and he did so by showing favour to Adela's favourite son, Stephen. Part of this involved Stephen spending significant periods of time in the entourage of Henry when he visited Normandy and held court at Rouen there. By the late 1100s, Stephen may have been as old as 16 or 17, and so was also in a position to accompany Henry on military campaigns in northern France. He even played a leading role in 1111 in suppressing the revolt of Robert of Bellême, a Norman lord with holdings in both England and the county of Ponthieu in France. The following year, Henry knighted Stephen, by which time he was at least 16 years old and perhaps as much as 20 years. Henry's patronage and promotion of his nephew continued in the years that followed. In the mid-1110s, Stephen crossed the English Channel to visit England for the first time and was given extensive privileges there. These included the honour of Lancaster, a feudal fief in the Lancaster region of England, one which made Henry one of the premier feudal lords of the country at a very young age. Further grants of land in the Alençon region of southern Normandy and elsewhere in France followed. All of this was conspicuous. By the late 1110s, it could be argued that Henry was promoting Stephen in a highly unusual fashion, almost as one would his designated heir. Perhaps this was owing to reservations which the king held about his own son and successor. William Adlin reached his 14th year in 1117 and began the passage into his adult years by the standards of the 12th century. He may have been something of a disappointment as he grew up. One chronicler of the time described him as a pampered prince who would be swallowed up by the volatile and aggressive politics of the time, whereas Stephen showed promise. Whatever Henry's plans were, they were soon altered by events outside of everyone's control. On the 25th of November 1120, after a major meeting of the court of King Henry I in Normandy, the king, his children and illegitimate children, along with the senior aristocrats and other courtiers, began making their way back to England. The king had made other plans, but the captain of a vessel named the White Ship, Thomas Fitzstephen, made the ship available to others to make the passage across the channel. That evening, what was, by all accounts, a fairly drunken royal party, one which included the king's heir, William Adlin, and numerous courtiers and nobles, as well as several of Henry I's illegitimate children, descended on the ship. There were approximately 300 in all, more than the ship could comfortably fit. This was fortuitous for Stephen, who was with the party and decided to get off and wait for another ship to travel over to England, leaving the drunken party to head on without him. Not long afterwards, he possibly watched as the White Ship struck a large rock which was almost entirely submerged in the harbour. According to the sources we have, all but one of the passengers drowned, an unusual development given how close to the shore they were. One might have expected that more would have swum to safety. Amongst the deceased was William Adlin, King Henry's only legitimate son and heir. His death would cast the succession issue wide open, and as a close male relative of the king, Stephen would become a major player in the scheming which followed in the 1120s. In the immediate aftermath of William Adlin's death, Henry's desire for a child of his own to succeed him became evident, despite his lavish promotion of Stephen in previous years. There was only one option left: Henry's legitimate daughter, Matilda. A girl of 18, she had already been married for several years to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful feudal lord in a politically divided Germany. Despite the fact that she was a woman, and that she was absent elsewhere in Europe and had been so for many years, Henry moved to make her his heir designate in the aftermath of the disaster of the White Ship. Admittedly, he did also try to shore up the succession in other ways. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, and Henry remarried shortly after the White Ship, this time to Adeliza of Louvain, a daughter of the Count of Louvain and a woman of perhaps little more than 17 years at the time of the marriage. The hope was that this second union with someone with many childbearing years ahead would produce a new legitimate male heir, but there was no luck on this front. The marriage would not lead to further children for Henry, the barren nature of it most likely being due to the king's own advanced years, as Adeliza would have a child many years later when she married for a second time. What this meant in the 1120s and 1130s was that Matilda remained Henry's only living, legitimate child and the heir to the throne of England. There were signs already by the mid-1120s that Matilda would be a tough sell as Henry's heir. In France itself, it was generally accepted that a woman could not succeed as a queen regnant or major feudal lady, the belief being firmly entrenched that the primary duty of a ruler was as a military leader and that this precluded women from ruling. The situation was more complex in England, a country which has had numerous female monarchs over the centuries. Henry hoped to placate his feudal lords and gain their acceptance of Matilda as his heir in 1128 when, after her first husband, Emperor Henry V, died in 1125, she was remarried to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, one of the more powerful lords of northern France, whose lands lay along the southern border of the Duchy of Normandy. This backfired, though, when the unpopular Geoffrey made the lords of England and northern France even more reluctant to accept Matilda as the king's heir. The ill feeling was compounded by high levels of taxation which Henry was imposing at the time to pay for several border wars in France. Unperturbed, Henry convened gatherings of his lords, including Stephen, on several occasions between 1127 and 1131 to have them swear oaths to accept Matilda as his heir when he passed away. Despite these outward shows of obedience, a major question still hung over events. Would these oaths be honoured when the king was dead, or would the lords seek to crown a male monarch? While this political wrangling and unrest was underway, Stephen's personal situation was changing too. Like his uncle, King Henry, he had left it relatively late to marry, but eventually, in 1125, he finally married for the first time, by which time he was either at the very end of his 20s or heading on for his mid-30s, depending on the year of his birth. To further confuse matters, another Matilda was involved, the third in our story so far. Matilda of Boulogne was a daughter of Count Eustace III of Boulogne, the ruler of the Boulogne fief near Calais in the northeastern extremity of France and lying along the shores of the English Channel. The county of Boulogne was a significant polity in the cross-channel politics between England and northern France. Furthermore, Matilda's mother was Mary of Scotland, a daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland. Hence Matilda was a niece-in-law of King Henry, her mother having been the sister of Henry's first wife. Accordingly, the marriage was politically astute and became even more important within weeks of the wedding when Matilda's father died without a male heir and she and Stephen ascended as Count and Countess of Boulogne, further strengthening Stephen's position in northern France and on the southern side of the English Channel. From his new lordship in Boulogne, Stephen continued to position himself to be a major figure in the succession politics of the second half of the 1120s and into the 1130s. He still was highly regarded by his uncle, who had facilitated the marriage union with Matilda of Boulogne. Stephen returned the favour by acting as Henry's representative in the region straddling northern France and Flanders in what is now Belgium. Here, William Clito, the son of Henry's brother Robert, was scheming to become Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful fiefdoms in northern Europe during the High Middle Ages. Henry was anxious to prevent this, and Stephen obliged him by undermining William Clito's efforts. This all stood in stark contrast to Henry's relationship with his daughter and heir Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou. They were pressuring Henry to begin transferring power to them before he died, principally by handing over control of castles and lands in northern France. Their argument that this would facilitate the succession to Matilda once Henry died was reasonable, but Henry did not view it as such, and the final years of his life saw a perceptible tension between the king and his daughter and son-in-law. It was under this cloud of deteriorating relations with his family members that old King Henry died at the start of December 1135. Chroniclers of the time suggested his demise was owing to eating too many lampreys, a type of fish. Perhaps this did play a part in his death, but in any event, Henry was well into his 60s by that time, and an old man by the standards of the 12th century. As news of the king's death spread, Stephen was well placed to position himself as a potential successor. The king had died in Normandy, and Stephen received the news before most other contenders for the throne, as he was not far away in Boulogne at the time. Geoffrey and Matilda were further south in Anjou, and such was their unpopularity by that time that few supporters rushed to their cause. Another plausible successor was Stephen's brother Theobald, the Count of Blois, though it soon transpired that he too lacked the kind of support which was available to Stephen. Stephen moved swiftly to capitalize on his advantageous position. He and his closest followers mobilized and quickly crossed the English Channel to arrive in England within days of Henry's death. There they faced some opposition from Matilda's supporters. Nevertheless, by the 8th of December, Stephen was near London, and in the days that followed cemented popular support for his accession in the capital and began taking over the levers of government. Over the next week, an agreement was worked out with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William de Corbeil, whereby, in spite of the Archbishop's oath to support Matilda's succession, he agreed to crown Stephen as the senior ecclesiastical Lord of England. Then a story was concocted with some of the late king's senior ministers, through which it was claimed that Henry I had renounced Matilda as his heir on his deathbed and approved Stephen as his successor. Then, with the wheeling and dealing done and those in positions of power convinced to support him, Stephen was officially crowned as King Stephen I of England at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135. It was just 3 weeks to the day since King Henry's death, and in France, Matilda was able to do very little to try to alter the trajectory of events. It was not the end of her claim to the throne, though. Far from it. In a somewhat unusual development, Stephen did not initially face military difficulties from rival candidates to the throne of England from northern France. Instead, the first 2 to 3 years of his reign were principally concerned with shoring up his position in England itself from fractious lords within England and border incursions from Wales and Scotland. The most pressing issue was to the north, where King David I of Scotland had taken advantage of the temporary lull in English royal power upon the death of King Henry to invade northern England. The lands here around Northumbria and adjoining shires were contested between the English and the Scots throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, and a diplomatic realignment pursuant from a change of king was a common reason for outbreaks of hostilities along the border. This one was more substantial than others, with David marching well into England and seizing the important northern towns of Carlisle and Newcastle. In response, Stephen marched north early in 1136 and campaigned against the Scots. Clashes over several weeks were enough to convince both monarchs of the wisdom of finding a swift solution. Stephen, who was anxious to end the campaign and return south in order to continue consolidating his position, ceded Carlisle to David in return for peace. With this concluded, Stephen headed south again. No sooner had he returned southwards than Stephen had to engage with an incursion from several Welsh lords into the March region between eastern Wales and the English West Midlands. The Normans had begun efforts to conquer Wales during the reign of Stephen's grandfather, William the Conqueror, but this was only ever a partial conquest and would not be fully completed until the late 13th century. While Stephen was absent in the north, campaigning against the Scots, several Welsh lords revolted, winning a significant victory at the Battle of Llwchor in January 1136. By the summer of 1136, there was a full revolt in progress in South Wales, led by figures like Owain Gwynedd, one of the Welsh princes. Stephen and several Norman marcher lords campaigned aggressively against them in the months that followed, but as with the Scottish border, Stephen was not committed to winning victory, merely to limiting any potential damage which war might cause. In 1137, he agreed peace terms through which the English state left the Welsh lords to manage themselves for a generation to come. That Stephen would make no further effort to intervene in Wales over his reign was owing to the outbreak of the civil war which would characterize both his reign and the entirety of English political history for a decade and a half in the middle of the 12th century. The anarchy began in 1138, a civil war which pitted Stephen and his supporters against those who wished to uphold old King Henry's desire for his legitimate daughter, Matilda, to succeed him. Matilda and her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had been committed to challenging Stephen's accession from the very beginning of the reign, but it was not until 1138 that they were in a position to press their cause. The Civil War was ignited when two very powerful English lords agreed to join their cause. These were Robert, Earl of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of King Henry I, and thus a half-brother of Matilda's. He was one of the leading peers of the realm, and had made clear from the very beginning that he was uneasy with the manner in which Stephen had usurped the throne in December 1135. In 1138, he agreed to take up arms in support of Matilda. Second was Ranulph de Gernon, 4th Earl of Chester. He was a leading Anglo-Norman magnate. Some of his lands in the north of England had been sacrificed by Stephen as the price of peace with the Scots in 1136, and his resentment at this led him to join the revolt when it began in 1138. Thus, with support from senior lords on both sides of the English Channel, Matilda and Geoffrey entered open conflict with Stephen. The first stages of the war occurred in 1139 when the Angevins, so named for the fact that Matilda's husband was the Count of Anjou, invaded England from northern France. With the die cast, Matilda's supporters made their allegiances clear. The dead King Henry's widow, Adeliza, also threw her support behind her stepdaughter. In the months that followed and into 1140, the battle lines were drawn as Matilda's faction won control over much of northern England, where Ranulph of Chester was one of the preeminent feudal lords, and in western England, with the port city of Bristol emerging as a stronghold for Matilda in the region, buoyed by Robert of Gloucester's strong position here. Meanwhile, Stephen retained control of the bulk of southern and eastern England, a position which gave him control of London, Oxford, and the wealthier parts of England around Kent and Surrey in the south, as well as into East Anglia and beyond. Although some parts of the country would be gained and lost by both Stephen and Matilda's supporters over the years, this was the general geopolitical situation which would pertain for much of the civil war that was just beginning. Yet, often the map was more complicated still, as local lords and magnates, or even church figures like the Bishop of Ely, gained control of small patches of land and shifted allegiances over and back as they tried to benefit themselves during the prolonged period of uncertainty. It was this chaotic situation, combined with the violence and the breakdown of royal government, which partly led to the Civil War becoming known as the Anarchy. One of the most critical episodes in the entire war began in the first days of 1141, when Stephen and his followers laid siege to Lincoln Castle, where Ranulph of Chester and some of his closest supporters were lodging. Stephen hoped to win this key stronghold lying between East Anglia and York in the north. At first, Ranulph seemed to be caught unprepared, but the move soon turned against Stephen when, at the start of February 1141, Robert of Gloucester arrived to Lincoln to relieve the siege and to try to strike a decisive blow against Stephen's cause. The resulting Battle of Lincoln was one of the most important clashes of the entire Civil War, though it probably involved little more than 1,000 men on either side, an indication of the limited nature of warfare in 12th century England. Gloucester and his allies had the better of it, owing to a large contingent of Welsh auxiliaries who had joined Matilda's cause in 1139. As their position became clear, many of Stephen's most important knights and allies fled from the field, and the battle soon turned into little more than an effort by Stephen and a small band of knights to try and fight their way to safety. They did not succeed, and by the time the clash ended, Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester were not just victorious, but had managed to capture Stephen as well. In the aftermath of the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was taken back as a prisoner by Gloucester to the West Midlands and was presented to Matilda. She ordered his confinement in Bristol Castle, and deliberations were now entered into as to what should be done. Matilda had seemingly won a clear victory, but Stephen was a crowned and anointed king, and in both canon and common law could not simply be dispensed with without a clear legal justification. Hence, several weeks of negotiations followed in which several senior archbishops and bishops of the English Church indicated their willingness to support Stephen's deposition and the crowning of Matilda as queen, though others refused. In the end, the breakthrough came when Stephen indicated from his confinement at Bristol that his supporters should allow Matilda to become queen. In the circumstances, he probably felt he had little choice, and so in April 1141, Stephen was to all intents and purposes deposed, and Matilda became queen. Unusually, she took the title Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English, rather than Queen, while many chroniclers of the High Middle Ages and for centuries afterwards referred to her as Empress Matilda rather than Queen Matilda, a designation owing to her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and her position as his empress. Matilda also continued to use the title long after leaving Germany. This uncertainty around her title reflected the realities of her limited power. When Matilda and her supporters attempted to descend on London to have her crowned at Westminster, the Londoners rejected her and remained steadfast in their loyalty to Stephen. In this fluid situation, with Matilda having emerged temporarily victorious over Stephen, the king himself imprisoned, though with parts of England refusing to acknowledge Matilda, the political landscape in northern France also experienced an important change. When news reached the county of Anjou of the defeat and capture of Stephen at Lincoln, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, invaded the Duchy of Normandy and occupied much of it. Stephen's older brother, Theobald, Count of Blois, did very little to stop him, being conscious of both the difficulty of withstanding the Angevin onslaught with Stephen's fortunes in such decline in England, and also having his own troubles to contend with against the French monarchy. The Angevins would retain control over most of Normandy throughout the 1140s and into the early 1150s, and henceforth the civil war would largely be contained to England itself. Geoffrey of Anjou was even able to have himself formally acknowledged by many of the Norman lords as Duke of Normandy in 1144. Stephen's cause was at an extremely low ebb in the spring of 1141. However, all was not lost. Though captive himself, his wife Matilda of Boulogne proved herself to be a capable leader of his cause while Stephen was being held at Bristol, and she soon managed to reassemble an alliance of some of England's leading magnates to resist Matilda's ascension to power, aided considerably by Stephen's brother Henry, Bishop of Winchester. They also had the support of William of Ypres, the leader of a major contingent of Flemish mercenaries from the Low Countries. In the autumn of 1141, their combined forces marched towards Winchester, where Matilda and Gloucester's armies were trying to secure the region for her and have the lords there acknowledge Matilda's accession as queen. What followed at Winchester on the 14th of September 1141 was a direct inversion of the result at the Battle of Lincoln 7 months earlier. Matilda's forces were routed and heavily defeated, and Robert of Gloucester was taken captive. In the aftermath of the engagement, Matilda of Boulogne and Bishop Henry of Winchester were able to trade Gloucester's release for the release of Stephen. Set at liberty at the beginning of November 1141, Stephen began to re-establish himself as king, and in December he and his wife undertook a second coronation as a means of reaffirming Stephen's position as King of England and in an effort to delegitimize Matilda's accession months earlier. Matilda was never formally deposed, and so across the 1140s there was a rival queen regnant in the shape of Empress Matilda and a king regnant in the shape of King Stephen. The anarchy would continue unabated for many years to come, despite the dramatic events of 1141. Having fortuitously gained his freedom in the late autumn of 1141 and begun to restore his authority, it all nearly came to a shuddering halt for Stephen the following year. Early in 1142, he fell seriously ill. What caused his illness has never been satisfactorily resolved. It could well have been the case that the circumstances of his imprisonment at Bristol Castle for several months the previous year had weakened his system and left him ill. The conditions might have been such that pneumonia or all manner of other sicknesses are possible. Whatever the cause, it is clear that contemporaries believed that Stephen was on the verge of death in the spring of 1142. Then, somewhat miraculously, he made a swift recovery and began an energetic new military campaign, one in which he managed to win over Ranulph of Chester for a brief time to his side in the war before laying siege to Oxford in the autumn of 1142. Empress Matilda was there at the time, and Stephen very nearly captured her, something which would have surely led to a major shift in the course of the war had he done so. It was not to be, though. Matilda and a handful of close supporters slipped out of Oxford Castle under the cover of night and made their way westwards. After the dramatic events of the years between 1140 and 1142, the years that followed in the mid-1140s saw the Civil War enter into a period of stalemate. Neither side made a major breakthrough, although at the same time there were near constant clashes between regional supporters of both Stephen and Matilda's causes. The conflict was extremely damaging, and many chroniclers of the time noted the devastation wrought across England and northern France. Agriculture was interrupted across the Norman dominions, and there was a general economic decline after a lengthy period of improvement under Henry I. Scores of castles were destroyed, and towns and villages sacked brutally by wandering bands of soldiers on both sides of the divide. It was this general sense of a land experiencing devastation for years which led the chroniclers to lament it so much, and for subsequent historians to term it the anarchy. Like many modern wars, it also led to innovations. The incessant warfare and the destruction of existing motte and bailey wooden castles led to a swift adoption of the new concept of stronger stone castles, particularly in England, where motte and bailey fortifications still dotted the countryside. As destructive as the anarchy was, it ushered in a period in the second half of the 12th century and into the 13th and 14th, in which some of England's finest stone castles were erected. By this time, Stephen was entering his 50s, and Matilda was also well into her 40s. Therefore, as the anarchy continued, the focus of it shifted in the course of the 1140s from Stephen and his cousin as rival contenders for the throne to their own offspring. Stephen and his wife Matilda of Boulogne had several children by then. Their eldest son, Eustace, was born around 1130. From the point at which Stephen claimed the throne of England in December 1135, Eustace was the next in line to become King of England, though clearly his position politically was marginal while still a child. By the mid-1140s, however, he was old enough to be promoted and was expected to engage in military campaigning himself. In 1146, he was promoted to the position of Count of Boulogne in France and knighted not long afterwards as his father began preparing him to succeed him one day. Stephen and Matilda also had a daughter named Marie who was born in 1136. In the late 1140s, Stephen began promoting her to play a prominent role in the female religious orders in England, a position which was essentially political in the High Middle Ages. Such was the power and wealth of the medieval religious orders. Another son, William, was married to Isabel de Warenne, the only legitimate child of William de Warenne, 3rd Earl of Surrey, in 1148, just a few months after Surrey had died. With this, William was promoted to become Earl of Surrey, through marriage at just 11 years of age. Finally, like his uncle Henry I, Stephen also had illegitimate children, the foremost of which was a son named Gervase, who Stephen had made the abbot of Westminster Abbey in 1138, an important ecclesiastical office which he abused through his corrupt behaviour. All of this was designed to embed Stephen's wider family into the political and aristocratic world of England, and to shore up his dynasty in the process. A similar situation was developing across the English Channel in the county of Anjou. Matilda and Geoffrey had 3 sons in the 1130s. Chief amongst these was their eldest son, Henry, an heir who became known to the chroniclers of the time as Henry Fitz-Empress, Fitz meaning son of, and the Empress referring to his mother's first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and continuing use of the title of Empress. Henry was born in March 1133 and was just a few years younger than Stephen's eldest son Eustace. Already by 1142, when he was just 9 years of age, his parents began involving Henry in the politics of the Civil War and sent him to England to spend time in the household of his step-uncle Robert of Gloucester. The point of this was to present in person Matilda's heir to the English lords who supported her cause. Henry, after all, would be her successor one day if she was to emerge victorious in the Civil War. And this is increasingly how the Civil War began to develop in the second half of the 1140s and into the early 1150s. It was no longer a conflict to see if Stephen or Matilda would rule in the long run, but which might emerge victorious in their old age and ensure the succession of their son Eustace of Boulogne or Henry of Anjou. The 2 sons became more central to the military campaigning as the years went by, especially on Matilda's side, after her second husband and Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died in September 1151, at which juncture young Henry became the de facto head of Matilda's military campaign. Even as the caste of those who were involved in the fighting changed, it remained a somewhat timid affair, such that several historians of the High Middle Ages have questioned whether we should even speak of a continuation of the Civil War in the late 1140s. One feature of this was the death of Robert of Gloucester in October 1147. With the passing of one of Matilda's foremost supporters in England, the political and military landscape changed further, so that Stephen and his allies were now more secure in their control of England, while Matilda and the supporters of the Angevins continued to control the Norman dominions across northern France. Another development was that the Second Crusade to the Holy Land began in 1145 and lasted down to 1149 in response to the conquest of the county of Edessa by the Muslim powers of the Levant in 1144. This drew many of the lords and soldiers who might have continued the war between Stephen and Matilda away from Western Europe to the east. In this environment, Henry tried to launch several invasions of England in the second half of the 1140s, but these amounted to very little. In one instance, Stephen simply paid off the mercenaries that Henry's army was largely comprised of and ordered them to return home to France. The final stages in the anarchy came in the early 1150s. By then, Stephen's position had been somewhat weakened owing to a dispute which had emerged between him and the church authorities in England since the mid-1140s, while Ranulph of Chester continued to hold control over large stretches of the north of England. In 1153, Henry Fitz-Empress, who by then had succeeded as Count of Anjou, and was able to deploy greater resources than on previous occasions, arrived to England again, where he built up support around Bristol and the surrounding region for his and his mother's cause. A period of pronounced military engagement and clashes followed over several months, much of it focused on a siege of Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire on the periphery of Henry and Stephen's spheres of control. Something very unusual happened at this juncture. Many of Stephen and Henry's closest supporters now indicated an unwillingness to participate in a new bout of violent engagements which could destabilize England in a way not seen since the early 1140s. Faced with this unprecedented situation, Stephen and Henry entered negotiations which were brokered by leading members of the English Church. The end result was the Treaty of Wallingford, also known as the Treaty of Winchester, which was agreed at the scene of the siege late in 1153. Under the terms of this, Stephen, who knew that he now faced a young, energetic and capable enemy in the shape of Henry, and who was also in a difficult position when it came to church support in England, agreed that Henry would succeed him when he died, something which many people assumed was not many years away, given that Stephen was around 60 years of age by that time. This involved Stephen abandoning the claims of his sons to succeed him as King of England, but would ensure peace during Stephen's final years. The Wallingford Agreement was confirmed shortly afterwards by a more formal treaty agreed upon at Winchester. The Treaty of Wallingford was a peculiar agreement. Through it, Stephen had effectively renounced the claims of his son Eustace or any of his other children to the throne of England. Eustace was clearly disgruntled with the decision, though there is a debate as to whether or not Stephen did genuinely intend to accept the terms of the treaty, or if he was simply buying time in which to strengthen his position again and would then recommence the war and impose Eustace as his heir. This latter theory certainly corresponds with some of his actions following the agreement. The months after Wallingford was finalized saw Stephen engaging in a flurry of activity. First, he tried to reduce the power of Hugh Bigod, a perennially overmighty feudal lord in England, while he was also building up his military base once again. A setback occurred when Eustace died suddenly and prematurely in the autumn of 1153, though Stephen's other son, William, now became a potential heir to Stephen. Questions remain as to whether Stephen was planning to eventually renounce the terms of the Wallingford Agreement and to try and make William his heir once he had built up enough strength and support for such a move. If this was Stephen's plan, it would never come to fruition. By the time the Wallingford Agreement was reached in 1153, the king was at least 57 years of age, depending on the time of his birth, and perhaps into his early 60s. Old age in the 12th century. Despite his advanced years, he spent the first months of 1154 travelling around England and making preparations for reform of the kingdom and perhaps to plot the succession of his son William. One major port of call was the northern city of York. He then traversed the entire country again, heading for Dover. The woman known to history as Empress Matilda was most likely born on the 7th of February 1102 at Sutton Courtenay in Berkshire in southern England. Her father was King Henry I of England. Henry was the youngest of the sons of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 had led an army across the English Channel and began the conquest of England from the Anglo-Saxons and Danes. Henry had claimed the throne following the death of his brother, King William II, also known as William Rufus, 2 years before Matilda was born, the previous king having been killed in a hunting accident which some viewed as suspicious. Matilda was named after her mother, Matilda of Scotland, a daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and his wife, the Anglo-Saxon royal princess Margaret of Wessex. Because of this lineage, Matilda was descended from the Norman kings of England, the Dukes of Normandy, the kings of Scotland and also the old Anglo-Saxon rulers of England prior to the Norman conquest. She was one of just 2 children resulting from Henry and Matilda's marriage. The other was a boy named William Adelin, who was born a year and a half after Matilda. As a male child, William became heir to the throne at his birth, but should anything happen to him, Matilda would become Henry's heir, though this would be problematic at a time when rulers above all else were expected to be military leaders. Henry also had over 20 children through his mistresses, but these were illegitimate and could not succeed him. Matilda was born into a political world in Western Europe which was much more complex than it is today. The divided nature of the region would have a bearing on her entire life. Matilda's father ruled England, which was already a reasonably centralized, unified kingdom, with growing influence over the Welsh lords to the west, and at least for a temporary period, reasonably good relations with Scotland on account of Henry's marriage to Matilda's mother, who was a Scottish princess. Things were much more complex across the English Channel. Here, Henry and his wider family ruled over the Duchy of Normandy in the north, while also having influence over some other territories, such as the County of Blois, through marriage alliances. There was a King of France here who ruled from Paris, but he in no way controlled territory approximating to the French nation-state today, though lords such as the Dukes of Normandy and the Lords of Anjou were nominally the underlings of the French king and owed him feudal homage. To the east, Germany was similarly divided into dozens of duchies, counties, and principalities, but, as in France, there was a semblance of centralized authority in the shape of the Holy Roman Emperors. At the time of Matilda's birth, Emperor Henry IV was the current Holy Roman Emperor, though from 1098 onwards he had begun to rule in association with his son and heir, the future Emperor Henry V. Though it may have seemed like a distant terrain to her growing up, events in Germany would play a role in Matilda's life from a very young age. We have a number of important medieval chronicles and histories extant for the history of England and Normandy in the 12th century, which are the principal basis for accounts of Matilda's life and reign. There are also sections of numerous chronicles and histories of 12th century Germany, which refer to Matilda in light of her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor between 1114 and 1125. Many of the English chroniclers, including William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, were contemporaries of Matilda and wrote extensively about her life and claims to the English throne. A few of these are positive, though the majority present a negative picture of her, notably the Gesta Stephani, which transliterates as the Acts of Stephen, a text which, unsurprisingly enough, given its title, was a partisan account in favour of the claims which Matilda's cousin Stephen had to the English throne. Unfortunately, a biographical history of Matilda's life, which was written by the French bishop and chronicler Arnulf of Lisieux, was lost in the late medieval period, a text which would have shed further information on her life, character, and reigns in Germany, France, and England. There were also numerous histories and treatments of Matilda's claims to the English throne written by Tudor historians in the 16th century, a period in which the rapid succession of Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I in 1553 and 1558 animated Englishmen to reconsider the history, merits, and nature of female monarchy. These chronicles provide a patchy account of Matilda's early life. She was raised around an itinerant court which often moved between England and northern France, with her father and mother residing for periods of time at Westminster near London or at Rouen in Normandy. It was an extensive court, one comprised of lords from England and France, where French was the lingua franca. Although she had only one full brother, Matilda grew up amongst a large brood of nearly 24 illegitimate half-brothers and half-sisters, and numerous first cousins, including the children of her father's sister, Adela, Countess of Blois. She may have received some education and tutoring from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, one of the most learned men in Christendom at the time, prior to his death in 1109. Other monks and bishops would also have tutored the children of the royal court at a time when educational standards in Europe were experiencing a major period of growth, which has led historians in recent times to speak of a 12th century Renaissance, which presaged the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. Matilda's formal education was a truncated one, owing to her position as a political pawn in the politics of Europe. As her father's only legitimate daughter, the issue of who Matilda would marry was always going to be an important one. As early as 1109, there were diplomatic negotiations underway between Matilda's father and Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful figure in Central Europe, for the emperor to potentially marry Matilda one day. Despite the roughly 20-year age difference between them, the overtures could not be ignored from such a prominent figure, and in 1110, when she was just 8 years old, Matilda was sent to Germany as part of a diplomatic mission where the diplomats who accompanied her finalized the negotiations with the emperor. Despite her ludicrously young age, Matilda's father agreed to the betrothal of his daughter to the emperor, and thereafter she was raised for the next 4 years in Western Germany in order to acclimatize her to the German culture and the language of the people she would become empress of in years to come. Even by the standards of medieval Europe, the decision to hold a wedding ceremony in January 1114 at the city of Worms, when Matilda was still a few weeks short of her 12th birthday, while Henry V was at least in his late 20s and perhaps as old as 33 years, was unusual. Typically, marriage ceremonies were not held until the participants were at least 13 or 14 and were deemed to be entering their young adult years by the standards of the time. Matilda would spend just over a decade as the Holy Roman Empress, the most senior royal woman in Germany. It was a tumultuous period in imperial history, as her husband was, in effect, at war with the papacy in Rome for control over northern Italy, a major part of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. Henry V had even been excommunicated with papal sanction in 1112, 2 years before marrying Matilda. In the first years after the marriage, Henry spent much of his time campaigning south into the plain of Lombardy, and after a time, Matilda joined him there with her entourage and household staff. At one point, in 1117, even heading south towards Rome itself, as the emperor tried to seize the Eternal City. Curiously, despite her young age, Matilda was playing an active role in political affairs by 1116 and 1117, with evidence pointing towards her attending government councils and acting as an unofficial sponsor of political measures that arrived to the imperial court. In 1117, she also claimed the title of Holy Roman Empress, as Henry emerged as the victor of the military clashes in Italy. However, the title was not given the imprimatur of Pope Paschal II, and whether she legally was entitled to call herself Empress or simply held the more junior imperial title of Queen of the Romans, was a matter debated for years to come. Matilda consistently maintained that she was the Empress Matilda, even long after leaving Germany. In 1118, Matilda's significance in her husband's government was made clear when he himself returned to Germany to quell growing unrest amongst several feudal lords there and left Matilda in charge of the imperial government south of the Alps in his absence. She played important roles during the years that followed, notably in the resolving of the investitures controversy, a long-running dispute between successive Holy Roman Emperors and popes since 1076, over whether the emperor had the right to appoint archbishops and bishops in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, or whether the pope had the final say in investing these ecclesiastical offices. The controversy was finally resolved by the Concordat of Worms, agreed upon in 1122 in the German city which bears its name. Matilda played an unofficial diplomatic role in the reaching of the major compromise which gave the emperors and the popes different roles in investing bishops across the empire. The trajectory of Matilda's life was immensely altered by the events of the 25th of November 1120. That evening, Matilda's brother and the heir to the English throne, William Adelin, set off with a large contingent of nobles and courtiers to sail from Barfleur in Normandy across the Channel to England. As well as William Adelin, several of the king's illegitimate children were on board, though Henry himself was not, having already made his own preparations for sailing back to England. The party is believed to have had a lot to drink before boarding the vessel called the White Ship, captained by Thomas Fitzstephen. It did not get far. Not far out into the harbour of Barfleur, the ship struck a submerged rock sticking out of the sea floor and soon began to sink. Of approximately 300 passengers, just one is said to have survived. Amongst those dead was William Adelin. With the death of her brother, the succession was thrown into complete disarray, as the king's only legitimate male heir was now dead. Matilda would subsequently become integral to the debate on the succession to her father. The White Ship incident would lead eventually to civil war and the anarchy in England and Normandy as Matilda's rightful place in the line of succession was questioned. In the immediate aftermath of the White Ship disaster, there was political turmoil in England and northern France. Henry had lost his only legitimate son and the obvious heir to his dominions. Now there was just Matilda alone amongst his children, who was a legitimate child, born in wedlock, and thus a potential successor. Many might have believed at this juncture that Henry would look outside of his immediate family for a new heir. Two potential candidates were his nephews, the sons of his sister Adela, Theobald, Count of Blois, and his younger brother Stephen. The latter might have been deemed an especially likely heir. Henry had shown immense favour towards Stephen in the 1110s as he was entering his adult years, bestowing extensive lands and feudal honours on him in England and making him the foremost figure in the Alençon region along the southern borders of the Duchy of Normandy. In retrospect, it looks as though Henry had been grooming Stephen as a potential spare heir during these years, should anything befall William Adelin. And yet, when the time came to potentially do so after the White Ship, Henry made it clear that Matilda was now his designated successor. Despite her father's efforts to cement her position as his heir, Matilda was only ever accepted by a minority of those who mattered, the knights and lords of England and northern France, and the senior ecclesiastical figures of the English Church. When the time came that Henry died and a successor had to be crowned, whether Matilda became queen or not would depend on the willingness of these men to honour the king's wishes. Many were reluctant. While England would accept female leaders in the centuries that followed, the issue of a female monarch was considered problematic at a time when the primary duty of a ruler was to lead their feudal lords into battle. This was also the case in France, where traditional law dictated that the position of queen regnant was not permitted, but instead only a queen consort to a king regnant. Aware of these issues, Henry would call his lords together on numerous occasions throughout the 1120s and into the early 1130s to have them swear formal oaths to uphold his plans for the succession. As a backup, he also married for a second time to Adeliza of Louvain in 1121. This marriage, however, would prove even more unsuccessful than his first when it came to producing legitimate children. No children resulted from it, and Matilda would remain Henry's sole legally viable heir. One of the other problems which Matilda's potential succession presented was that she was an absentee heir. Back in 1114, she had married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. While this was a politically important marriage to one of the most powerful figures in Europe at that time, it also meant that she was living in Germany and other parts of Central Europe in the early 1120s, even as Henry was trying to convince his lords to accept her as his heir. In an age before any form of mass media, such as printing, having a physical presence in one's dominions was extremely important. It was why kings and queens regularly went on journeys around their kingdoms in order to be seen in the flesh and reassert their authority to their subjects. Matilda's absence in Germany was doubly difficult because of this. After all, the lords of England really had no idea who they were being asked to swear oaths to in the early 1120s. Perhaps Matilda was a strong, poised woman who could make a good ruler one day. On the other hand, perhaps she was the direct opposite of this, a weak-willed, insignificant person who could not be respected as a potential heir. The point was that nobody could be sure, and this made Henry's task all the more difficult. In the end, the English king's son-in-law, Emperor Henry V, resolved this problem by dying prematurely in May 1125 of some form of cancer while campaigning in the Low Countries. He and Matilda had no surviving children, though, as noted, a child had been born years earlier but died in infancy. The imperial title thus passed to Lothair of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony. Freed from her marriage bonds and with no children or family tying her to Germany, Matilda returned home to England in 1126. There, her father's knights and lords would have had their first sustained impression of the woman who Henry wanted to rule over them one day. They should have been reassured to some extent. Matilda was a poised, capable woman, one who might not have been able to lead them into battle in the traditional sense, but who many would have believed could make a good queen. Still, others could never be convinced of the plausibility of a female monarch, and others were disillusioned more broadly with high levels of taxation which the king was imposing and which deepened their opposition to his succession plans. After a spell in England, Matilda crossed the English Channel and took up residence in Normandy. Here she continued to style herself as Empress Matilda despite the death of her husband, the Emperor, in 1125, an affectation which subsequent chroniclers and historians were happy to continue, and Matilda remains known to history as Empress Matilda to this day. In France, her father soon arranged another marriage for her. This time, the proposed groom was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son and heir of the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. The counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine were sizable feudal lordships which lay to the south of Normandy, north of the county of Poitou, and to the west of Paris. They covered a substantial proportion of north-central France, and so Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey was, at least on the surface, an astute move, which ensured Matilda would have financial and military backing if she had to fight for her crown after Henry died. Yet the marriage was problematic in other ways. Geoffrey was still 10 weeks shy of his 15th birthday when they married on the 17th of June 1128, and once he succeeded as Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine the following year, he soon developed a reputation for heavy-handedness which aroused the animosity of some of the more minor lords of Normandy to the north. This alienated some further potential supporters of Matilda, though in the end the resources which Anjou was able to bring to bear after Henry's death were crucial in keeping Matilda's hopes of claiming the throne alive. The late 1120s and early 1130s were difficult years for Matilda. Much of this was brought about by the ongoing issues concerning the succession. By this time, Matilda's first cousin, Stephen of Blois, was emerging as a clear rival. Back in 1125, around the time Matilda's first husband died and she began preparing to return to England, Stephen had married Matilda of Boulogne, who had just succeeded as Countess of Boulogne. This made Stephen lord of one of the foremost polities of northern France, one which lay right on the coast of the English Channel, as well as further lands in Kent in southeast England, further strengthening his position. Meanwhile, Matilda's marriage was troubled, and within a year of it Matilda decided to leave Anjou and went to live in Normandy. A reconciliation was arrived at in 1131. However, the entire situation had irked Matilda's father, who believed she was letting her personal feelings get in the way of the need to find a lasting political solution to the succession crisis. The last years of Henry's life witnessed a steady decline in the relationship between king and daughter, though he never indicated any shift in his thinking on the succession. That Henry was steadfast in his determination to have Matilda succeed him was, perhaps, the result of the events of 1133. That spring, Matilda gave birth to her first child, a relief after a long and largely childless marriage to Emperor Henry V, and several years of marriage to Geoffrey without an heir there either. Born on the 5th of March 1133 at Le Mans, the boy was named Henry by his parents after his grandfather the king, a pointed statement to Matilda's father and the political realm at large that Matilda now had an heir of her own, and if she did become queen in succession to her father, it would be an interim reign of sorts in preparation for the eventual accession of another King Henry one day. The king was elated, and the birth led him to cross to Normandy to see his grandchild. A reconciliation seemed to have been effected between he and Matilda. It was short-lived, though. A year later, Matilda gave birth to another son, this one named Geoffrey. The birth was difficult, and it seemed that Matilda would die at one point, leading to a new dispute with her father about the terms of Matilda's own will and her proposed burial place. Thus, the rapprochement between father and daughter did not last long. Matilda's father died on the 1st of December 1135 while in Normandy. Even though he was around 67 years of age at the time, he had been campaigning in northern France against a rebellion of some of the lords of Normandy at the time of his death. Though the king had never flinched from supporting Matilda as his successor, his daughter and son-in-law were offering some support to the rebel lords at the time of Henry's death. The king's death was rumoured to be due to eating too many lampreys, a kind of fish. Perhaps some form of food poisoning was involved, although his death at such an advanced age could also have just as easily been from natural causes. As the news spread, it became evident that Henry's lords and knights did not all intend on supporting Matilda's claim to succeed him. Instead, many began scheming immediately. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's first cousin, quickly seized the initiative. Within a week of the king's death, he was in England and gathering support from senior church figures and nobles. Then he gained the acclamation of the people of London, and finally was crowned as King Stephen I at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death. Stephen had managed to secure the crown in breach of the wishes of Henry I in large part because of propitious timing and positioning. When news of the old king's death began to spread, Stephen was not far away from Normandy in Boulogne and was best placed to cross quickly to England. The same could not be said of his brother, Theobald of Blois, another potential candidate for the throne. Similarly, Matilda was further south in Anjou and barely had time to react before news arrived that Stephen had been crowned at Westminster in England. Another reason why Matilda was able to do little to prevent Stephen from seizing the crown was that she was pregnant again when her father died, and in mid-1136 would give birth to her third and final son, William. Each of her sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William, would be known to contemporaries and for centuries to come by the names Henry Fitz-Empress, Geoffrey Fitz-Empress, and William Fitz-Empress. Fitz meaning son of, and Empress referring to Matilda's decision to continue using this title long after the death of her first husband. Matilda and Geoffrey did not immediately commence a war with Stephen to try to reclaim the throne for Matilda. They simply were not in a strong enough position to do so. Instead, they would wait a few years, slowly gathering allies and preparing militarily and financially for the coming war. What tipped their hand and what led to the outbreak of the civil war known as the Anarchy was when numerous powerful lords of England signalled their support for Matilda's cause and opposition to Stephen in 1137 and 1138. The most prominent was Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate half-brother of Matilda's, whom Henry I had promoted to become an earl and to hold extensive lands in England. From Stephen's first arrival in England in December 1135, he had indicated his reticence to accept his cousin as the new monarch, attempting to block his coronation. He was joined in now throwing his backing behind Matilda by Ranulph of Chester, another powerful English earl with considerable land and support in the northwest of the country. Matilda also gained the support, for a time, of King David of Scotland, who hoped to gain further lands along the border through his involvement in the Civil War. The anarchy began when Robert of Gloucester rebelled in 1138. The following year, Matilda arrived to England at the head of an army from France. Over the next few years, the conflict would develop, with Matilda, Geoffrey, Gloucester, and their other allies holding much of the West Midlands and West Country for Matilda's cause, and establishing the port city of Bristol as their base of operations, while Stephen retained control over London, the surrounding home counties, and East Anglia. Most of the fighting in the anarchy would play out in the Midlands and regions like Oxfordshire, which lay between Bristol and London. In the war which followed, Matilda most certainly lost the PR campaign. While the German chroniclers who wrote about her time as the wife of Emperor Henry V between 1114 and 1125 were generally favourable towards her, as were many French writers, in general, Matilda was perceived badly by the English chroniclers and historians. They viewed her as a foreign upstart who was married to the much reviled Count of Anjou. Why this was the case is not entirely clear. Stephen, who was portrayed much more sympathetically by chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, was hardly an Englishman himself, having been born in France, hailing from Blois, and being Count of Boulogne in northern France prior to seizing the throne of England. Conversely, he had spent periods of time in England since the mid-1110s and had extensive estates there, whereas Matilda, though born in England, had always been a distant figure in Germany, Italy, and France. Stephen also appears to have been more humble, whereas English commentators were at pains to stress Matilda's proud and often overbearing nature, something which led one writer to refer to her even in her later years as being of a tyrannical disposition. All of this was evinced in her insistence on being termed Empress Matilda. Unquestionably, the most consequential events of the anarchy, other than those that brought it to an end many years later, occurred in 1141. Early that year, Stephen was laying siege to Lincoln Castle when Robert of Gloucester marched with several hundred knights and a large contingent of Welsh allies to relieve the siege. The Battle of Lincoln ensued on the 2nd of February 1141 after Gloucester and his forces arrived. It was a decisive defeat for Stephen, one in which he was abandoned by many of his allies under pressure from Gloucester's forces. Stephen and his own entourage became surrounded in the midst of the melee, and despite their efforts to fight their way out, Stephen was captured by Gloucester's forces. Now a prisoner, he was taken west towards Bristol, where Matilda ordered his imprisonment in Bristol Castle. This incredible victory left Matilda seemingly victorious, though Stephen's cause was not defeated. No sooner did word arrive to London and Westminster of the king's capture than his wife, confusingly also named Matilda, began gathering forces to strike back against the Empress and to keep Stephen's cause alive. The brief war of the two Matildas which would follow would soon lead to another major shift in the military and political landscape. All of that lay in the months ahead. In the immediate term, Matilda had won a major victory over Stephen and had her great adversary in captivity. She now moved to claim her birthright and fulfill her father's wishes for the succession by becoming ruler of England. And yet, there was a peculiar aspect to this. Although Matilda generally used the title of Empress, and she was now aspiring to become Queen, she did not adopt either of these titles, instead issuing royal charters and grants under the title of Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English. In early April, she and her followers, along with some leading figures of the English Church that she had won over to her cause, arrived to Winchester, home of one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in Europe and a very important centre of the medieval English Church. There, Matilda was made queen in a makeshift ceremony. However, A subsequent campaign to try and seize London failed, and Matilda gained neither the acclamation of the people of the capital, nor was she crowned at Westminster. This was despite winning over Geoffrey de Mandeville, who controlled the Tower of London at the time, yet when Matilda advanced to try and enter London, the inhabitants indicated their clear unwillingness to allow her entry. Somewhat surprisingly, she did have the agreement of Stephen himself, who told some of his supporters to agree to the coronation of Matilda, perhaps fearing that he would be murdered at Bristol if he did not. Nevertheless, many people continued to view Matilda's coronation as entirely illegitimate. Matilda did not have long to enjoy her success. The other Matilda, Stephen's wife, Matilda of Boulogne, had gathered sufficient forces by this time that she was able to begin campaigning into the Midlands with the aid of her brother-in-law, Henry, Bishop of Winchester, and William of Ypres, a lord of the Low Countries who had brought mercenary troops to England to aid Stephen. On the 14th of September, they descended on Winchester and thoroughly routed the forces which were gathered there in support of Matilda. The rout of Winchester was significant in that Robert of Gloucester was also captured during the fighting. With her foremost ally and half-brother now in the hands of Stephen's wife and his allies, Matilda had no option but to arrange for the release of Stephen from Bristol. Hence, not much more than half a year after defeating Stephen at Lincoln, capturing him and having herself proclaimed as Lady of the English, Matilda was forced to release her cousin, and the Civil War was back to being as contentious an affair as it had ever been. Because Matilda did not renounce the titles she had adopted in April 1141, it is usually held by historians of the period that there were, in effect, two monarchs of England that had been crowned in different ways, King Stephen and Queen Matilda. This situation would continue throughout the 1140s. This was a period of a truly peculiar amount of instances in which the leaders of the Civil War were captured, imprisoned, escaped, or narrowly avoided being detained. Matilda herself had two close calls. The first came in 1141 when she was at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire. It had been built a half a century or so earlier by the Bishop of Salisbury and became one of the foremost strongholds in southwestern England by the end of the reign of Henry I. Matilda was here in 1141 when some of Stephen's forces arrived there. They appear to have been unaware that Matilda was at Devizes. Nevertheless, any effort by her to try and escape would have resulted in her being detected. Consequently, she decided to sneak out by dressing in burial clothes and then being tied down onto a funeral bier. Her attendants then carried her out of Devizes as though they were removing a corpse. Apparently, Matilda stayed in her prostrate and bound position for many hours until the company had made their way entirely out of the region in which Stephen's forces were marauding and to the safety of Gloucester. Later, her forces recaptured Devizes, and she would reward the inhabitants for their help in aiding her escape, granting them a royal charter to hold markets as a small borough town. A second close call occurred in 1142. After the rout of Winchester and the release of Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, the fighting in 1142 began to centre on Oxford. Stephen became aware that Matilda had moved her government here by that time and came to the conclusion that if he could capture her, it would strike a definitive blow and end the war. Thus, in the autumn, he advanced on Oxford, the site of an impressive castle and a town which had already emerged as a centre of higher education. Caught unaware by the advance of Stephen's forces, Matilda and her followers were trapped inside Oxford Castle as a siege began from September 1142 onwards. By the winter, over 2.5 months into the siege, conditions inside were dire, with Matilda and the others short of all manner of supplies. Stephen's plan to capture her was nevertheless foiled. In December, the Lady of the English and a handful of close followers escaped from Oxford Castle and avoided detection by Stephen's troops to make their way back west towards Bristol. There are differing accounts of how she made her escape. One has Matilda simply leaving through a postern or rear gate of the castle. Another tale, a more romantic though not implausible one, claimed that Matilda and her allies shimmied down a rope out of a window of the castle to safety and then made their escape dressed all in white to camouflage themselves against the snow which had blanketed Oxfordshire that December. Whichever is true, we do know that Matilda made yet another narrow escape and continued to fight on against Stephen into the mid-1140s. While the war had taken many shifts and turns in England in 1141 and 1142, matters were more clear-cut in northern France. Here, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had invaded Normandy and largely took over the duchy for her cause in the early 1140s. Normandy would remain under Angevin control for the most part of the remainder of the war, with Geoffrey effectively adding Normandy to the counties of Anjou, Maine and Touraine to become a French lord who could rival the King of France in terms of the size of his lands and power. By this time, the battle lines of the war had clearly emerged. France was lost to the Angevins, whereas in England Matilda controlled the West Country, West Midlands and part of the northwest of England, while Stephen had a solid base of support in the south, the home counties around London, north to East Anglia and further north again towards York. The Midlands were the front lines, though the anarchy, as the chronicles written at the time make resoundingly clear, was leading to devastation all over England as local lords and knights used the chaos and the breakdown of royal power as an opportunity to extend their own lands and benefit themselves. The mid-1140s was a period of relative inactivity in the Civil War by comparison with the dramatic events of 1141 and 1142. First, the two sides became evenly matched and consolidated their control over various parts of England. Then, events far away to the east conspired to limit the scale of the conflict. In 1144, the county of Edessa, one of the 4 major Christian Crusader states that had been established in the Levant as part of the First Crusade half a century earlier, was captured by a Syrian Muslim warlord by the name of Zengi. When word of these developments arrived to Western Europe, a new crusade was preached and gained huge support. The King of France, Louis VII, was amongst those who took the cross and headed for the Holy Land. With their liege lord having committed to the Second Crusade, many French lords, the backbone of Matilda's support in the civil war with Stephen, agreed to head east as well, though some were diverted to Iberia in the end, where Lisbon was conquered for the Christian cause in 1147. To compound matters, several of Matilda's other allies died during the mid-1140s, including Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who was killed in a military clash against Stephen's forces in 1144, and her most faithful ally, her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, who died nearing his 60th year in a relatively peaceful repose at Bristol Castle in the late autumn of 1147. All of this ensured a lull in fighting during these years. The period that followed saw a fundamental change in the nature of the war. By then, Matilda's eldest son, Henry Fitz-Empress, was entering what would be considered his teenage years today, but which in the medieval era were deemed to be the first years of adulthood. In such a situation, he was increasingly presented as the potential future king if Matilda and her allies were successful in the conflict, with the possibility even that Matilda would rule in association with her son. As early as 1147, when he was just 14, Henry crossed to England from northern France at the head of a large force of mercenaries that had been hired to compensate for the loss of many troops that had headed on crusade. A symbolic changing of the guard followed as Robert of Gloucester passed away, and then Matilda left England herself in 1148. The latter decision was partly taken owing to a clash between Matilda and the Bishop of Salisbury, Jocelin de Bohun, over the ownership of Devizes Castle, the stronghold in Wiltshire which Matilda had made her dramatic escape from disguised as a corpse back in 1141. The bishop claimed control over Devizes, even though Matilda often resided there. The dispute had escalated in the mid-1140s, with de Bohun even involving Pope Eugene III. Deciding to cut her losses, and with her son now playing a more prominent role in affairs, Matilda headed for France. She would spend most of the remaining years of the Civil War at Rouen in Normandy. The political situation continued to shift in the period that followed. A critical moment came when Matilda's second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, died suddenly and unexpectedly at just 38 years of age in September 1151. A chronicle written by John of Marmoutier claimed that Geoffrey had been attending a council of his nobles and advisers at Le Mans when he suddenly came down sick with a severe fever. His illness was swift, and he died on the 7th of September. He was buried in Saint-Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, where Matilda had an effigy of him placed over his tomb. On this, his personal coat of arms, which included a blue shield and gold lions, was displayed in one of the earliest examples of the use of a heraldic coat of arms in medieval Europe. It is significant that Matilda commissioned this, and the coat of arms in question influenced the royal coat of arms of the English monarchs in centuries to come. Geoffrey's death otherwise cemented Henry's status as the leader of the war effort on his mother's side, as he became Count of Anjou, now aged 18, and effectively Duke of Normandy as well. Already emerging as a shrewd military leader and political ruler, Henry, in conjunction with his mother, began playing a diplomatic game in the early 1150s, whereby the papacy, the King of France, and the Lords of England were all courted to support Matilda and Henry's claim to the throne, the realization being that diplomacy might gain what war had failed to acquire over the previous decade. On the opposing side, a rival was emerging to Henry. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was a few years older than Henry and was being presented to the English political nation by Stephen as his successor. This was even more relevant on that side of the English Channel, as Stephen was upwards of a decade older than Matilda, and it was probable that he would die before his first cousin. Thus, from Normandy in the early 1150s, Matilda was conscious that the clash was now to see if Eustace or Henry would succeed Stephen. The days when she might claim the throne herself and rule in her own right in realization of her father's wishes so many years earlier were passing. Events culminated around the siege of Wallingford Castle in 1153, where Stephen hoped to defeat one of Matilda's major English allies, Brian Fitzcount. Henry campaigned against Stephen to prevent this. After a stalemate had been reached yet again that summer, an agreement was reached, variously known as the Treaty of Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester. Through this, Henry agreed to end his efforts to supplant Stephen and accept him as King of England, with the condition that when Stephen died, Henry would succeed him, not Eustace or any of Stephen's other sons. The Treaty of Wallingford had seemingly brought the anarchy to an end after 15 years of civil war and decades of tension over the succession. One wonders what Matilda's reaction was in Normandy when news of the agreement which her son had reached arrived there. The settlement was perhaps not as concrete as it appears, though. In the months that followed, Stephen embarked on a flurry of activity to rouse his allies and tour England. It leaves the suspicion that he was making plans to try to renounce the agreement and commence the war again once the time was politically advantageous. However, just as the death of members of the royal family during the White Ship disaster in 1120 and of old King Henry I in 1135 had led to the anarchy, the deaths of two royals in quick succession ended it in the mid-1150s. First, Eustace died unexpectedly in August 1153, and then Stephen died just over a year later in October 1154. With this, the anarchy came to an end. Matilda was victorious, though the victory was largely for her son, who quickly secured control over the government of England after Stephen's death. He was crowned on the 19th of December 1154 as King Henry II at Westminster Abbey. Fittingly, during the ceremony, one of the crowns which was used was that which Matilda had brought back from her time married to Emperor Henry V in Germany 3 decades earlier, a symbolic statement of how Henry's mother had kept her line's claim to the throne alive since her days in Central Europe as a young woman. With the death of Stephen and the accession of her son as King Henry II, Matilda found herself for the first time in nearly 2 decades not fighting a war to claim her birthright and to implement the wishes of her father. She had not become queen herself, but her eldest son, who she had symbolically named after his grandfather, had. Matilda was victorious, and she now entered a period of quasi-retirement. She did not live in England, remaining instead in Normandy and spending the remainder of her life here. Although Henry was the Duke of Normandy, his mother acted as one of his senior representatives here as the new king, unlike his great-grandfather and grandfather, William the Conqueror and Henry I, viewed himself primarily as an English monarch rather than a French lord who just happened to be King of England as well. During these years, there was also a symbolic effort to acknowledge Matilda's position as the daughter of King Henry I. Consequently, despite her retirement in Normandy, we have royal charters and other government documents from the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, which bear both Henry and Matilda's names and royal seals, a tacit acknowledgement that although Henry was the king, he had only become so through his mother stepping aside to allow him to succeed Stephen. During her later years in Normandy, Matilda became a major patron of the church and the religious orders in northern France. In particular, she was known for the favour she bestowed on the Augustinians. These were a religious order that lived monastic lives in accordance with the religious strictures of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great early church fathers. In 1059, agreements were reached concerning monastic life at the Lateran Synod, and this prepared the way for the emergence of the Augustinians as a religious order which challenged the supremacy of the Benedictines across Christendom in the 12th century. Matilda was a major patroness of them in northern France, both during the anarchy and especially during her semi-retirement, when money could be diverted to the purpose and not towards raising armies, though both the Benedictines and the Cistercians also benefited from her benevolence. She bestowed funding on the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, for instance, an institution which she had patronized for decades, and also on Bawdsley Abbey in Worcestershire in England. In all instances, there was an awareness of the political benefits of patronizing religious abbeys and houses which played a prominent role in local politics, something Matilda had become aware of in her early years in Germany and had deployed as a political tool for decades. Her initial patronage of Bawdsley, for instance, dated back to the early 1140s, when she cultivated relations there as a means of securing control over Worcestershire in the context of the Civil War. This political scheming aside, there is no doubt that Matilda was a genuine favourer of church reform and revitalisation, and she continued in her later years to sponsor the church in Normandy and further afield. Matilda was far from politically dormant in the years following the accession of her son as king. Though most of the letters involved are lost, it is clear from the chronicles and other ancillary evidence that Matilda maintained an extensive correspondence with her son during the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, with letters passing from Normandy to England and back again, as she advised him on many political issues. One topic on which she tried to advise Henry concerned Thomas Becket, a leading prelate and politician who was appointed by Henry as Lord Chancellor of England shortly after his accession. In 1162, Becket was promoted to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury within the Church. This brought the formerly loyal Chancellor into conflict with Henry, as the pair clashed over the rights and privileges of the Church and the degree to which the Archbishops of Canterbury were answerable to the Pope in Rome alone, or had to also seek the permission of the kings of England before acting on various matters. The dispute would intensify throughout the 1160s. Matilda advised Henry to de-escalate the situation. He did not take her advice, and eventually in 1170 Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, though the degree to which Henry sanctioned the assassination has been extensively debated ever since. She also advised Henry not to launch a military expedition to Ireland in the 1150s to begin conquering the neighbouring island from its many Irish lords. Perhaps she was right. Henry did eventually sanction such a campaign after his mother died, beginning centuries of English entanglement with Ireland. Matilda was into her 60s as her son's relationship with Becket began to deteriorate. She lived eventually to be 65 years old.